Right, so in this quick video I'm going to provision a Node.js website in Azure. So I'm going to go to my app services. I'm here in my Azure portal, app services and add, and I'm going to look for Node, and then I look for this Node.js empty web app. There's also a starter site, but that's a little bit more sophisticated. I just want a very simple empty web app which will come back and say hello world, and then I click on create, and I need to set some parameters here. So I'm going to say let's say Node.js starter 101. Looks as though that name hasn't been taken already. I'm going to use my Azure free trial and use one of my existing resource groups. If I can select it, that's not the one I wanted. And then I'm going to click on create. So it's now going to go off and create and deploy that new Node.js site. Don't click on this create button again or you'll get another one. So if I go back to my list of app services and keep refreshing, you'll see this appear in a moment. So this is Node.js starter 101, this one. This is the one that we've just created. And I can now go into the overview page for it, and you can see that there's a link to the GitHub repository where they store the sort of the template for this site. Now, what we're going to do is go to this quick start button for the app deployment, and we're going to click on Node.js, and we're going to say local source control. Now, there's a prerequisite here that you have to set up some deployment credentials. You only need to do it once for your Azure tenant. I've already done it, so I don't need to go in again and set it again. But you'd go in and set those there if you hadn't already got some deployment credentials set up. Now we go to the local Git repository deployment source, and what we're going to do is set that up. And in fact, clicking on this here is exactly equivalent to clicking on deployment options in the blade. So it's already connected to that GitHub repository. I'm actually going to disconnect it. Once that's done, this setup cog lights up again, so I can click on that and we can now do some reconfiguring. So I'm going to select local Git repository, OK, and now if I go back to the overview, you'll see that this Git clone URL has changed, and now instead of pointing to GitHub and the sort of the master starter copy, it's actually, or rather the local copy in Azure. So I'm going to copy that URL using this click to copy here, and now I'm going to go and open a PowerShell window. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the git clone command, so git clone, and then paste in that URL that I just picked up from the Azure portal, and it's now going to take the contents of the Azure portal, and there's a set of credentials which I'm going to enter off screen here. So these are the credentials that you would have set up for the deployment options in the Azure portal. Entering those now, and that gets me into that Git repository that's in Azure and copies everything over. So now I've got a subdirectory here called Node.js starter 101, and if I go into that, you can see there is a certain amount of file structure there. If I run the Visual Studio Code editor inside there, you can see the structure of the files, and we've got a file here, server.js, which is using the HTTP server. You could also use Express, which I'll probably edit this later and change this and use Express and replace this with my own logic for rendering the site, and set Node to something else like I think 6.5.0 is all I'm using at the moment. Up here I probably put some dependencies in to make sure that I can pull that in automatically. So that's the site. Now that's not complete. That won't run at the moment because there's no Node modules directory. So that is being provisioned in the real site in Azure, of course, but we don't put that into source code. So if I want to run that site locally, I would do npm install in here. You should see that there's now Node modules. Go to the GitHub client that's built into Visual Studio Code. And if I were to go and change one of these, let's just artificially change the server.js file, and we'll put brave new world in here. So I've made a change. I will save that. I'll also save that change as well. And now if I go to the Git part of Visual Studio Code, I can actually made the world braver, and commit those changes. And now what I could do is I could do a push or a sync up into the copy of the repository that's in Azure. If I go back to the Azure portal, you can see that I've got a link to the copy of the site in Azure. So it's NodeJS Starter 101 Azure website, and there's Hello World. So that's rendered from the copy of Node running in Azure. If I want to run it locally, I have to go here and I can do a Node, and it was server.js, wasn't it? So I can do Node server here. So let's do that now anyway. We'll push those changes up. So we've seen that it says Hello World. We'll push the changes up. Remember, we changed this to Hello Brave New World. So this is doing a git push from my local copy of the repository up into the Azure copy of it. And in fact, if I click on these deployment options, this here, you can see that there's the made it braver. That was my commit message, and that should now be active. So if we go back to here and refresh the page, we should see that yes, the new version of the thing has been deployed. So now I can go back to Visual Studio if I want to, and I can start making more changes, or I can completely swap out this and use Express and a templating engine like Handlebars or whatever I want to build in here. Now, one thing we still need to do is map this to a URL. So if we go to custom domains here, so at the moment the URL is NodeJS Starter 101 Azure Websites.net, but I can map it to some other host. So I would go in here, say add a host name, and then I happen to have one that's called peakpark.info. Use that one. So this is a domain that I already have set up. I can validate that, and it's going to look at the host name records, and you have to put some special records in there to verify that you own it. So I would then need to go to my domain service provider, go to the DNS and add a record. So I'll add a text record that says the text record with peakpark.info as the target and NodeJS Starter 101.azurewebsites.net as the content of the text record. And then I would take the peakpark.info a record and map it to this. So I have to point it to this IP address. Okay, so and then from that point I can navigate to it. I'd be able to type peakpark.info in here and it would get to this page, and I can take it from there. And that's about it. That's all there is to it.